A woman alone in a cabin built for two lives a life, measured by seasons and silence. On the anniversary of a day that once promised a future, the vast wilderness that surrounds her decided to reveal a secret. What she discovered was not a monster, but a mirror to her own grief, and the choice she made would leave a mark on her soul that no passage of time could ever erase. The woman's name was Elena. She lived in a small cabin nestled deep in the mountains, a place of sharp pines and cold, clear streams. The cabin was sturdy, built from cedar logs her husband had felled himself. He had built it for them, a fortress against the noise of the world. Now it was just a fortress for one. He had been gone for 3 years. Today would have been their 5th wedding anniversary. Morning light, thin and pale, sliced through the kitchen window. It illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. Elena moved with a quiet economy, a habit born from solitude. She stoked the wood stove, the scrape of the iron poker the only sound. The fire caught with a soft whoosh, its warmth a welcome ghost in the room. Outside, the autumn air was crisp and carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. She pulled on her worn leather gloves and went to the woodpile. Each swing of the axe was a familiar rhythm. The thud of steel on wood was a punctuation mark in the long, rambling sentence of her day. It was a physical task that quieted the noise in her head. But lately, the quiet had been different. It was heavier. For the past few weeks, a feeling had taken root in her, a primal sense of being watched. She would be tending her small garden and feel a weight in the air, a pressure that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She would turn, her eyes scanning the dense, unmoving wall of the forest. She never saw anything. Then came the sounds. At first, they were distant, easily dismissed as the wind or a branch falling under its own weight. But they grew more distinct. A heavy, deliberate footstep just beyond the clearing. A powerful snap, far too loud for a deer breaking a twig. One night, she awoke to a sound that chilled her to the bone. It was a cry, low and mournful, a resonant expression of a sorrow so deep it seemed to shake the very ground. She had told herself it was a bear, or perhaps an elk. But the sound held an intelligence, a note of something that understood loss. It echoed the hollow ache in her own chest. She would lie in her bed, listening to the lonely call, and feel a strange kinship with the unseen source. It felt as lonely as she did. On the evening of her anniversary, the feeling was more intense than ever. She sat at the small wooden table, an untouched plate of food before her. The silence in the cabin was a living thing, pressing in on her. She thought of his laugh, of the way his hand felt in hers. Grief was a tide, and tonight it was high, threatening to pull her under. That is when the cry came again. It was not distant this time. It was close, and it was different. The morning was still there, but it was threaded with a sharp, raw edge of pain. It was not a call into the void. It was a cry for help. Logic screamed at her to stay inside, to bar the door and feed another log into the stove. The woods were dark and held dangers she knew well. But the sound that ripped through the night air was one of pure agony. It bypassed her fear and went straight to the part of her that remembered the helplessness of watching someone you love suffer. She stood up. Her hands moved with a purpose that was not her own. She lit the old oil lantern, its yellow light pushing back the shadows in the small room. She grabbed the heavy woolen blanket from the back of her chair. She walked to the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She paused, her hand on the iron latch. The cry came again, weaker this time, ending in a guttural gasp. She opened the door and stepped out into the cold night. The lantern light carved a small, trembling circle around her. Beyond it, the darkness was absolute. She followed the sound, her boots crunching on fallen leaves and pine needles. The air grew colder as she moved away from the cabin, deeper into the trees. The woods felt ancient and indifferent. She found the source near a cluster of massive, moss-covered boulders that marked the edge of a steep ravine. The lantern light fell upon a shape, a form so large it seemed to soak up the darkness around it. It was slumped against one of the rocks, a mountain of matted, dark fur. Elena froze, her breath caught in her throat. It was taller than any bear, its frame powerfully built with long, muscular arms. Its head was bowed, and its breathing came in ragged, shallow bursts. It was a creature from myth, from whispers and grainy photographs. It was impossible, yet there it was. Fear, cold and sharp, seized her. She wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of her locked cabin and pretend she had seen nothing. But her feet were rooted to the spot. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the cause of its distress. Its left leg was caught. An old, rusted bear trap, a relic of a crueler time, had clamped its jagged steel teeth deep into the creature's calf. The heavy anchor chain was wrapped around a thick, gnarled root, holding it fast. The creature slowly lifted its head. In the swaying lantern light, she saw its face. The features were not monstrous. They were intelligent, expressive. Its deep-set eyes, dark and profound, found hers. There was no malice in them. There was only exhaustion, agony, and a terrifying vulnerability. The myth became a reality, and the monster became a victim. In that moment, her fear was eclipsed by a wave of profound, aching empathy. She saw not a beast, but a living being, trapped and in pain, alone in the dark. It was a feeling she understood completely. The internal conflict lasted only a second. Compassion won. She did not run. Instead, she took a slow step back. She held the lantern high so it could see her face, see her empty hands. She made no sudden movements. The creature watched her, its massive chest rising and falling with labored breaths. It did not growl. It did not threaten. It simply watched. She turned and walked back to the cabin, her mind a storm of adrenaline and disbelief. She moved with a strange clarity. She returned not with a rifle, but with a metal bowl filled with fresh water from the pump. She also brought the heavy bolt cutters from her husband's old tool chest. Their weight was both terrifying and reassuring. Her approach was slow, deliberate. She stopped about 15 feet away, just at the edge of the lantern's glow. She set the bowl of water down on the ground, pushing it forward slightly with her foot. "It's for you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The creature watched her every move. It looked at the water, then back at her. It made a low sound in its chest, a deep rumble that was not a threat, but a question. She understood. She slowly backed away, retreating to the edge of the trees, and sat down on a fallen log, keeping the lantern by her side. She would wait. For a long time, nothing happened. The creature remained motionless, its gaze fixed on her. The forest was silent around them, as if holding its breath. Finally, with immense effort, the creature leaned forward. It stretched out a long, powerful arm, its huge, dark fingers reaching for the bowl. It drew the water back and drank, its thirst immense. A silent understanding passed between them. Elena stayed there for over an hour, a silent sentinel in the cold. When she finally stood to leave, the creature watched her go. She returned to her cabin, but she did not sleep. She sat in the dark, watching the distant, flickering light of her lantern that she had left behind. The next day, she brought food. Apples and carrots from her garden, a loaf of bread she had baked. She left them in the same spot as the water. She spent the day at a distance, a silent companion to its suffering. The creature ate the food when it thought she was not looking. A fragile routine was born from desperation and compassion. On the third day, a cold rain began to fall. She knew she could not wait any longer. The wound would fester. She took the bolt cutters and the woolen blanket and walked back to the boulder. The creature was weaker now, its head resting on the damp earth. It watched her approach with those same weary, intelligent eyes. This was the test. She walked closer than ever before, stopping just out of its reach. She held up the bolt cutters so it could see them. A low growl rumbled in its chest. Its muscles tensed. It could end her life with a single swipe of its powerful arm. It was a warning. Elena stopped. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she held its gaze. She did not show fear. She lowered the cutters and held out her empty hand, palm up. She stood perfectly still, letting the cold rain soak her hair and clothes. She was offering a choice: trust or fear. An eternity seemed to pass in that single moment. The creature's eyes searched her face, looking for any sign of deception. It looked from her eyes to her outstretched hand, then to the terrifying metal tool on the ground. The growl subsided, replaced by a shuddering sigh. It lowered its massive head, a gesture of weary consent. It would trust her. She moved slowly, kneeling in the mud beside it. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. The smell of wet fur, rain, and blood filled the air. She could feel the heat coming off its body. She reached for the rusted chain, her small hands looking frail next to its immense form. She positioned the jaws of the bolt cutters around one of the thick links. The creature trembled beside her, but remained still. It watched her hands with an unnerving focus. She squeezed the handles of the cutters with all her strength. The old metal groaned in protest. It took all of her weight, all of her resolve. With a loud snap, the link broke. The chain fell away. It was free from the anchor, but the trap itself remained clamped on its leg. The creature let out a low moan of pain and relief. Then, it did something that stunned her. It slowly reached down with its own hands. With a control and strength she could barely comprehend, its huge fingers found the release mechanism of the ancient trap. With a guttural cry that tore through the rain-soaked forest, it pried the steel jaws apart. It pulled its mangled leg free and slumped back against the rock, panting from the effort and the agony. Blood flowed freely from the deep wounds. It looked down at its own injury, then it turned its gaze to her. The look in its eyes was one of clear, unambiguous gratitude. It then extended its massive, scarred hand. It was not a threat. It was an offering. Resting in the center of its broad, leathery palm was a single object, a smooth, perfectly white stone, worn by years in a riverbed. A gift. Tears mixed with the rain on her face. She reached out and took the stone. Her fingers brushed against its skin. For a brief second, her small, human hand was held in its immense one. It was a connection across an impossible divide, a shared moment of grace. Just then, a sound echoed from the deep woods. A soft, resonant call. Another voice answered from a different direction. They were not alone. The creature beside her lifted its head. It gathered its strength and let out a low, answering call. It was a sound that said, "I am here. I am safe." With great effort, it began to push itself up. It struggled to its feet, favoring its injured leg. It stood to its full, towering height, a giant silhouetted against the dark woods. It looked down at her one last time. There was no sound, but its message was clear. A slow, deliberate nod of its head. "Thank you." It turned and began to limp toward the treeline. From the shadows, two other shapes emerged. They were just as large, just as powerful. Its family. They moved to its side, supporting it, helping it along. They did not look at Elena. Their focus was entirely on their own. Together, the three massive figures moved into the darkness. They did not rush. Their retreat was orderly, deliberate. They melted into the ancient forest, becoming shadows among shadows, until they were gone. Elena stood alone in the rain, the heavy bolt cutters at her feet. The forest was silent once more, but it was a different kind of silence. It was not empty. It was full. The world felt larger, deeper, and more mysterious than she had ever imagined. She walked back to her cabin, the white river stone clutched in her hand. Its surface was cool and smooth. Its weight was real. She placed it on the mantelpiece, next to the framed photograph of her and her husband on their wedding day. Two impossible things, side by side. She never told a soul. Who would believe her? They would call her crazy, or worse, they would send hunters and scientists into her woods, turning a place of wonder into a circus. The secret was hers to keep, a sacred trust. She had been given a gift, and she would protect it. The encounter did not erase her grief. The ache of her loss remained, but something had shifted inside her. Her solitude no longer felt like a punishment. She had faced the impossible, the embodiment of the wild, and had met it not with a weapon, but with an open hand. In its eyes, she had seen not a monster, but a being that understood pain and recognized kindness. On the anniversary of her deepest connection, she had forged a new one, silent and profound. The forest was never the same again. Its silence was now a conversation, and she was no longer its only lonely inhabitant.